We are on the field, and let's start her up here with the cute little clickety clacks and so forth and so on. Hi, RJ Downard here, and this is today's Evolution Hour. Just barely prepared. Just got on my stuff organized here, and back to our exciting little logo, tortucan.wordpress.com. Troubles in Paradise, the methodology of creationism, where I am endeavoring to slaughter creationism one source at a time. Okay. So, I'm just by myself here for the moment. Jackson is off busy doing work, we're writing a book. The rocks are still there. That will be dismantling answers in Genesis. In fact, that was what was occupying me quite a bit today, making some revisions in chapter 2 on radiometric dating and some little goofball stuff that was being brought out from some assorted creationists that I found out about as a consequence of some back vetting from some geology critics of the thing. So make sure that our stuff is bulletproof. Anyway, that is the case. We'll find out whether or not we'll be having anybody in the... Oh, hi, BJ! There we go. I don't know whether the BJ asks if you ever got the sound going on the intro. I have the volume on slightly when I play the opening intro. Whether or not it actually comes across that way at your end is another matter. And whether it sounds very good or not, I don't know. I haven't back-lauded on that. I'm still an oaf when it comes to a lot of this video stuff. I'm not one of these fancy people like Pelogio who can get all of his video organized and do the graphics and all of that. I'm not quite up to that speed. I'm a talking hit at the moment. Anyway, we're moving into the Homo naledi section of the exciting Contested Bones book by Christopher Ruppy and John Sanford, who are young Earth creationists, although they're not exactly going out of their way to say so. And I was asked to analyze this book by a critic of creationism who didn't want to spend all the time doing it themselves. So they sent me the book. Thank you. And I'm doing exactly that. And because it has no index, it has no bibliography, I'm going through source by source, constructing all of that and tracking down the original source material. They're now in the Homo naledi chapter of things, which is an interesting little taxon, which is yet more example of the diversity of hominids knocking around in the last few million years. And Ruppy and Sanford's position is the one that, oh, this is just human beings. They're just human fossils. But it turns out it's a little more complicated than that, because creationists are sort of divided on the subject. And I put some neat little links up to Joel Duff, who did a survey of various creationists who were shooting their mouths off on Homo naledi. And Ken Ham's bunch tends to regard it as just an ape. But Kurt Wise is sidling over onto the human side. And it all has to do with this burial aspect. But they don't really pay a great deal of attention to the details in the bones. And, of course, Ruppy and Sanford clearly want to riff off of every bit of controversy involved. And you have a camp between Lee Berger, who is the team that found the fossils, and then Tim White and a few others who are somewhat critical. But what's interesting is nobody in the debate is arguing that they are Homo sapiens. Tim White suspects they're actually a variant of Homo erectus and don't quite deserve their own species designation, which is the issue with Berger. But that kind of gets downplayed. Ruppy and Sanford will kind of touch on it after a bit. But what I've done is put up the main papers, the two big Berger papers, Berger and Dix, and then the 2017 one that's under Hawks. That found some additional fossils in there, and you can go through and read those at your leisure and see what's going on, plus some of the critical stuff that was lobbed in by the anti-evolutionists. And the thing is that creationists have to have an arbitrary dichotomy. Oh, hi, Benjamin. See you, and Brian. Hi there in the live chat. I was right up to the last minute before I started up today. I ask your pardon on that, because I've been busy working on stuff. In fact, I'll give you a little heads up on the thing I was looking at today, where the issue of whether or not this Triceratops stuff had been radiocarbon dated and what it means to radiocarbon date dinosaurs. And there's a small amount of it. And it turns out that it's a case of likely contamination. It's very easy to do. And literally, I found some additional examples. Paul Geim drew upon this material. He's a young Earth creationist from Loma Linda. And he was citing some technical papers, including the microspectroscopic evidence for Cretaceous bone proteins by Lindgren, where Geim cherry picks and alludes to this as finding a date of 20,000 years ago. And I opened up papers. I already had them in my bibliography. But they pointed out that it would most likely reflect bacterial activity near the outer surface of the bone, although no bacterial proteins or hopanoids were detected. One bacterial DNA sequence was amplified by PCR, and microscopic clusters of bone-boring cyanobacteria were seen in places along the perimeter of the diaphysial cortex. And that they just leave out. So the data selection part comes into play a lot in this matter, and it's going to pop up as a little sidebar note in the new Rocks book, because I'm going into radiometric dating oops, things falling off my little sides here. It's very easy in this project to get overwhelmed by the technical literature and the incoming stuff, because I'm tackling this from a second area. Just not only am I criticizing and analyzing things that have been done by creationists, but I'm also trying to stay ahead of the creationists and keep up with the technical literature, so that it's less a matter of having to chase after their errors. And that's usually relating to older technical literature that has to be tracked down. And I'll be discussing a little bit of that later on. But also the matter of knowing the technical field, so you're not thrown off by the incoming information, which tends to get kind of blown out of proportion. Beach says, I like it when the scientists argue the finer points. That's how science works. That's the neat thing about it, because if everybody were just operating in lockstep, it's through that interplay between varying camps and people saying, yeah, but that it improves the science process. And then you have to wait and to see how the dust is settling. But the interesting thing is to see in the creationist shell game how they're cherry picking their material and avoiding the parts that don't fit the model. And the last thing that a creationist can allow is an actual transitional to where something is, well, it's not quite that, it's not quite that. That's because it's transitional. So they have to pigeonhole. Everything's got to be this or that. And the problem is that the biological world looks like lots of almosts. And everything is an almost until it gets to the point where you go, yeah, it's now actually kind of this. But if we go back farther, it looks like the almost. That's what we see in the reptile-mammal transition. We see that in dinosaurs. We see it in early crocodiles. We see it in our hominid line. All of that. There's just piles of almosts. And hello, Corag. I got some people in here today. And Brian Stevens says, my fingers think they are flurfers. I've had some interesting interactions with flat earthers. I sort of got into that world because of SciStrike and getting on his video where they go after them most of the time. And in some sense, flat earth is ridiculously peripheral, because there are very few flat earthers out there, and most of them don't have any impact on anything. They may get, you may go, what? A flat earther in 2019? But from a methods point of view, they're a useful learning tool, because the reasons and mechanisms that their brains do to think the earth is flat in 2019 is exactly the same mechanisms that creationists use, or anti-vaxxers, or people who don't like Shakespeare writing Shakespeare's plays. Same methodology. They cherry pick, they're relying on secondary sources, they don't fact check, they don't read widely, they don't figure out what they think happened, and nothing will persuade them that they're wrong. They're absolutely intractable. They're tortugans. So when you look at that from the source methods level and you fact check stuff, you learn stuff, for one thing. And you also, like, how did I know that the P900 camera was the camera of choice for flat earthers? You know, I wouldn't have known this little factoid if it were for SciStrike and all the thing. The other issue is that from a practical point of view, once you understand the source methods things, you can focus on the people that are actually making a difference, that are in the government, they're in Congress, they're running governors, they're in the Trump administration, their counterparts are running Turkey, they're in Brazil, There's all sorts of places around that have minds that operate in just the same method. And they're having real impact on people, because if somebody can believe something that's so radically wrong, what's going to stop them from doing stupid decisions, even if they're able to make reasonable things most of the time, but they can roll off the deck. Governor Huckabee, for example, who was a young earth creationist, would sometimes annoy his own supporters by taking stances that were very atypical. Well, it's because they just decide what they want to be true, and then they proceed accordingly. So anyway, Homo naledi, back to the topic of the thing, will be a matter that I'll be looking at for the next few chapters, because they're going to be pigeonholing it as just a human being, or maybe somehow contaminated. And it's that geological context and the detail descriptions of things that matter, and also the systematics, where when they can't even acknowledge that the people they're trying to rely on secondarily, like Tim White and I think Glenn Martin is the one piece that Rupi and Sanford started off with, that was saying how critical the Tim White was of Homo naledi being classified as its own independent species. And if you read the whole article, you find out more about it. Nobody is arguing that they're Homo sapiens. So there's a hide the ball quality to the mechanism, and you find that out in the source level. So I'm trying to encourage everybody to get open more and more on that. Yeah, but Brian says, when mind is open, things sometimes fall out. There's that old cliche. Yeah, you don't want to be so open-minded that your brains fall out. And that's the thing, is that when you look at Tortugan ideologues, and you see that in creationism, obviously, they're hyper-skeptical about things they don't want to be true. Oh, they just dig in their heels. Or flat earthers will be saying, oh, those pictures of the spherical earth, they're all of CGI. But when it comes to their hobby horses, they're hypercredulous. They believe everything that source says, and they never bother to fact check it. They can't even imagine that it's wrong, and they don't tend to do experiments and so forth and so on, and deal with all that little technical information stuff. So I recommend that anybody that gets involved in any of these issues, whether it's creationism or any other area, always try to ground in primary sources. And I'll have some examples of some stuff on cognitive literature and the atheist brain that I'll be mentioning in the second half of the show. I put the links up to it on that, and some stuff from a Kent Hovind video. As usual, they're just slinking along. And I'll do my preemptive shameless plug on Evolution Slam Dunk. Everybody who doesn't have this should. A, I can use the royalties, and B, it's a really great book. I wrote it specifically to tackle the reptile-mammal transition, which had not been properly covered in anti-creationist literature and needed a good updating. And I'm quite proud of it. I think it's a good, hefty assault. It goes after most of the heavy guns of anti-evolutionism. Tackled the RMT at some point, kind of, sort of. So by going through that issue, I'm able to pick off most of the people in the intelligent design movement, and Dwayne Gish and company over in Young Earth Creationism. So, the Correct says, luckily my skeptic side kicked in and pressed me to question all the evidence, including reevaluate the flat earth evidence. Yeah, if the intriguing thing is that let anybody make their argument, fine. But then you say on what evidence that you do it, and is it grounded in things you can test out empirically to find out whether or not it's right or wrong? So things that are just being lobbed videos. That's why I don't like to try to defend evolution by just putting up a video thing, although individual videos can be extremely informative. But ultimately, they should rest on science documentation. And even people who do videos, I'm trying to do this in my own clumsy way here, but I recommend everybody who does videos make a point of having easily accessible primary sources available. You may not be able to have everything available open access, but stuff that you can, that's salient, put it up as linkages in your video description so everybody can follow up and you don't have to take their word for it. You shouldn't have to take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. Check it out on your own. Do some reading. Find out about stuff. Go to those libraries. Check out books, and source check. I had a joust with a particular creationist who was assaulting me for implying that I had read all these science papers. You couldn't possibly have done that. Well, I showed the math and showed, it's on average, about 4 papers a day. And if anybody that knows me personally knows just how much information I chew through, yeah, I mean, I read a lot. And you can skim analysis through a technical paper. Technical science papers are ones where the abstract is telling you the meat of the thing. But what I'm doing in a farther road is that when I'm following up on technical information, it's usually not the abstract that I'm looking around for. It's the topic that's buttressing the abstract, and I'm often looking for details relevant to specific technical points. So I have to go down through quick to see if particular elements are coming up and where they're coming up. And I'm fairly fast at it. It's my gig. I'm good at that, as other people are good at throwing footballs or painting or doing other things. I'm pretty good at source analysis, and I'm quick at looking things up. So I made no apologies on it. Anyway, the same person who was complaining about my supposedly reading all these technical papers, you couldn't get him kicking and screaming to actually read any himself. So, and he at one point, I brought up my favorite example of ALUs, which are about 10% of our genome, and they're a terrible problem for creationism if they start thinking about them. Were all these designed? They're retrotransposons that copy themselves in our genome, and they came from the primate side of the family. There's a distant cousin of it that's over in the mice that Jonathan Wells kind of glanced past in his junk DNA book. But anyway, I contended that no anti-evolutionist has offered a good explanation from their perspective of what the hell is thinking going on. Are all of these things designed, really, even the ones that cause diseases? And he thought to lob at this thread a link to creation.com, and never bothered to even look at the things that were being linked to at this. All he did was just put in ALU in their search engine and came up with like 5 examples, and it didn't occur to him to read any of it. And he's thinking that's supposed to impress. Well, I looked up all the stuff and found out what was going on. One of them was in Finnish, so I beg off having to respond to an article that's in Finnish. But all the other ones were talking about different issues. They were disputing pseudogenes and other things, but they weren't making an argument about ALUs, and they weren't citing any technical literature, not one of them, on how many of the ALUs they thought were functionally, intentionally designed to be there by God the Almighty, which they were all creationist arguments. Some from John Woodmarapp, who I know is a manipulative source generator, and there were a few others in there. And Robert Carter, he popped up as that as well. That's another thing that's been occupying me for the last few weeks, is diving into one of the things that I'm going to be putting into the new Rocks book on Carter, because he is basically riffing off of John Sanford. Carter, by the way, is an actual biologist. He's got a degree in it, but he's also a young Earth creationist and suffers from the same little problems. BJ on alien visitors. I figured the alien visitors thing when I realized there were 3 main people pushing each other's evidence, sort of like creationists, really. Yeah, that's a very relevant point, is to try to find out how many people are involved in it. Basically, it's Eric von Daniken, and then there's also Hitching, I think his name is. He's got a website, not Hitching is another name. It suddenly escaped me, and he works with another guy. So there's a very small number of core fact claimants. I'm not focusing a heck of a lot on ancient astronauts. I'm going after the creationism thing, and one of the things that I've been doing in the TIP project is pinning down who the fact claimants are. So who is simply copying an argument? They may cite technical literature even, but did they really read this on their own, or are they merely copying things from somebody else? Mike Riddle, for example, who copies technical literature that he siphons from Andrew Snelling. So Riddle is not a fact claimant, but Snelling is a fact claimant. So gradually I worked out, and there's only about 60 in all of anti-evolutionism currently, only about 60 people who are the active fact claimants. That's ridiculously small. I keep track of the technical literature, and just the listing of the scientists who wrote all of that technical work, I've got 65,000 people in that list. And then I can cross-check to see, are the people who are doing the anti-evolution amongst the doing the work list? And the answer is almost invariably no. So all of these are quite peripheral. And when you have a field that's that small that people are riffing off, ancient astronauts makes young Earth creationism seem like a big league thing. Ancient astronauts is just a ridiculously small cluster of non-archaeologists, non-scientists, Eric von Daniken was a manager of a hotel in Switzerland and got the bug back in the 60s. I remember reading his stuff when it came out, and he's still knocking around. And then that little twerp who is on the History Channel shows that's still going on, historical pornography, as I like to call it, on ancient astronauts. It's kind of a cosmic inferiority complex, is how I described it in the old tip work, because I've got some things about the ancient astronaut stuff lurking in the background. And in fact, I have a thing called the von Daniken defense that I gave a name to in honor of Eric von Daniken. And that related to where you say, well, we deal with the same data. We just have a different way of looking at it. No, you don't deal with the same data. And von Daniken also, it falls apart in the idea that not every explanation is plausible. And so merely because even if you were dealing with all the same data, not just snippets of it, your explanation isn't necessarily a good one. And von Daniken is terrible at that. So anybody that keeps up with that kind of stuff, I don't know that anyone's done any detailed demographics. And if anybody knows of any papers on the subject, let me know about just how many ancient astronauters there are. They'll overlap somewhat with the creationism movement. Because, and I was noticing this in the old tip book, that Old Scratch says ancient astronauts is comedy gold. They try so hard. It's hilarious. Yeah, they're so pompous and they're so superficial at the same time. They've got the graphics. And if you do a source analysis, I've not analyzed all their stuff, but every once in a while, they would bring up an interesting topic that like pyramids and other stuff that I decided, yeah, I'll just take a look and see what they do. If you do, try to do a source analysis on them. Try to pin down an external source that justifies the claim they're making. Don't assume everything they say is true. So if they bring up numbers, there was one where they were claiming about how similar the proportions are of the pyramids in Mesoamerica, the one at Teotihuacan and Temple of the Sun and the Great Pyramid. And it turns out, no, not really. And another one is where at one point, this is the one I did analyze, and the advantages of high definition television and DVRs that you can freeze frame. They were saying that the layout of the Teotihuacan was matching the solar system, and they had a quick overlay of a solar system. Well, I was able to freeze frame, and I would mark down where they thought the orbits were supposed to be in relation to this layout of Teotihuacan, and then crunch the numbers of the actual solar system, and they were just way off. There was no match at all. It was just arbitrary squashing planets in to fit. It was terrible. So this is a lot of post hoc occultism, and you can learn an awful lot that way, and you'll find out about actual archaeological sites. This is probably a golden age of archaeology if we can keep people with guns from shooting people at certain sites. And there's so much that can be known because we can read Mayan now that we couldn't before. And there's so many new techniques for analyzing things, and there's so much faster movement of data because we're in an internet era. So it's delightful. And the last thing you need is that silly stuff that's on the ancient astronaut stuff. Yeah, Korik says, von Daniken, when you listen to him, is really good order. He's good at telling stories, but they aren't stories. They're logical fallacies. Almost every word is argument from ignorance or incredulity. Yeah. That now that we're in the 1960s, you wouldn't have had access to a lot of the direct archaeological information, and the tools that we have now weren't available. They can do digital reconstructions of things, measure things down to millimeter accuracy with global positioning. And so a lot of the stuff that was done seat of the pants back in the 1960s is now done with laser scanning and stuff. So they can up the ante enormously. So the amount of information that's available is vastly greater. And as with creationists who don't keep up with the data curve, that's also the problem with the von Danikenites. And God, I wish I could think of his name. He's an English fellow. Again, starts with an H. He's one of this bit with the super advanced civilizations of the past argument that intersects with some of the von Danikenism. And it can intersect then with some of the creationist lore, because they want to have kind of advanced people in Noah's day. And then that bumps into cryptozoology. There's that young earth creationists that want to have dinosaurs wandering around in swamps in Africa. And so there's constant overlap of this down at the Carl Baugh level, at the Childress. He's now gray-haired, but he was doing stuff. If you read my old Dynamania chapter, I have this section in on flood geology, and Childress pops up in that Mysterious Origins of Man special that Charlton Heston did in the 1980s, I think. And that same impetus occurs in that grassroots level of anti-evolutionism and the need to have some kind of a mysterious past stuff. And it's only continued, but it's still relatively peripheral. It pops up a little bit in some of the apologetics of Answers in Genesis, but only barely. And by the time you get up to the higher echelon ideologues, they don't really pay too much attention to that because it doesn't fit the scriptural framework. So there we go. I keep on looking over because I'm all by myself here, so I'm checking over periodically in the live chat to see what's been going on. I'll put up my, we're getting close to the half hour. I'll go ahead and put up my other shameless plug, which is our thanks to the people who are patrons. Finally, I've unlocked the actual Patreon-y thing at Patreon. So now the cash flow is actually moving. So I thank you, everybody who has been and continues to be and shall become in future a patron. And so I shall read your name in great honor here. Our colleagues Andrew and Hendril and Eric, and our researcher class, Keith and Finno and Brad and Ralph and Meet Convert Me and Pelagia, hey Pelagia, and Sur, and assistant researchers Dyer and Duranko and Nyanya and Steggles and Suris, who I will always point out is helping doing the audiobook of Paralogs of Fog, which I still got to get back into. Too many irons in my fire, and Todas Real, and friends, Eatmeal and Stephen and Marigale and Daniel and Bo and Alex and Paul and Zeshi, and some legacy patrons who helped a bit earlier on and only in spot things, but still it was money in the kitty. And thank you very much, Jen and John and Mona and Son and Everett. I am constantly thankful for everybody who has stepped up and helped on this, because I know it's a weird thing. I'm just a talking head, and who am I to command the idea that you should be helping out with money? But nonetheless, that's what I've been sent to do, to keep things flowing and continue to work on the process here and get more books out and things in future. The grand hope is to have a better website and to have some assistants and things, the people who can take over after I'm gone, because I don't want this to fizzle out after I'm gone. There's too much information and too much task ahead. So anyway, there's my website. And there's all that chapter material that's up there, and links to the books are all available there. There's the Patreon site. It's also in the links in the description for the video. And then GoFundMe.com. That's another way to help out, and you can do recurring payments and things there too. You know, $1, $5, whatever, or more if you can handle it, or one-time things. Say, hey, instead of going to the movie, I'll get Downard's book, or slop a little money his way, because it's a good project. So it's all volunteer. Remember, think about all of the creationists and flat earthers who are monetized on YouTube, and people sending money to them so they can build arc parks and all that stuff. And then think about the old RJ and people like me. And I'm not alone in the place. I mean, Richard Carrier uses Patreon as his main source of income now, in addition to his books and lecturing and the like. So this is a new world we're all getting into. And here I am in my den here in Spokane, Washington, doing my work here. I have to make sure that I've got my internet connection, because I functionally am doing research online, and this is being put out online. So this is the new world that's going on. We can kind of bypass the old area where everything had to be done by pamphlets and personal interactions in local spots. Now we can be on a global stage, but it also means we have to up our ante in terms of our rigor, in relating to sources, in always being honest and fair with the facts. These are the source method standards that everybody should attain. And the more that we hold everybody feet to the fire to make sure that they do that, and get reporters on the field as well. Local media, everybody should be using a source methods approach, which is you can make a claim, but on what basis do you make it? What sources do you have? Have you fact checked the sources? How many politicians could survive a source methods analysis? I don't know. And we would definitely want to make sure that fewer and fewer Tortukans get into the field. And I've got my hashtag that nobody uses much. So I'm not holding out hope that this is ever going to become a trending hashtag, but Tortugan alert. That when you find somebody that is blowing smoke rings or showing an inability to look at sources or think about things they don't want to think about, automatically, if they're creationists or flat earthers or anti-vaxxers, you'll probably be justified in flashing a Tortugan alert. And make sure by your own actions and method that nobody could ever flash one at you, that you never violate those rules about always seeking out primary sources, being fair to them, trying to find out what the facts are, making your decisions based upon as much of the information as possible, being willing to change your mind. It's Kent Hovind there, Korag, yes. I've debated Hovind, and you can see the link to my debate with him in the video description. That's another one. It's about, I think, 2,000 some odd people have seen it so far, but that's way below the amount that see some creationist videos or Aaron Ra, or he has much bigger audience levels than I do. But I'm very proud of the debate, and I think I derailed Kent in a way that not even Aaron Ra has managed to pull off, because I'm approaching it from a source methods direction. I'll say again, remember, there's 3 layers to thinking. There's a philosophy level up at the top. That's, God or matter, or big philosophical issues. Why is there something rather than nothing? Eventually, you're talking about the data field, which is what all that stuff that we're talking about, whether it's fossils or biology or genetics and anything else. And then below that, which people tend to forget, is that source methods thing. How rigorous are you with documentation? How careful are you to get primary sources? How much do you read the material that you are presenting? How much do you work out your own hypothesis and work out what would change your mind? Where would be problems with it? That's how you grapple with stuff. And you'll find that people who believe things that aren't true, who get Tortugan alerts, are invariably screwing up at one or more of those source methods problems. And so long as you don't do that yourself, you have a better argument and a better approach to things. Yes, I swear my face. Yes, it changed to Hovind. Kent Hovind, and he's got his kid, Eric, who is kind of disowning his dad. He had a little bit of problems with him because he's an imperious little crust. Eric is much more amiable, and he's sidled over to being a channeler and enabler for more conventional creationism. So he gets people from largely Answers in Genesis on as guests on his thing, and does glossy videos. So he's way ahead of old RJ here that doesn't have any video technology to deal with. But methodologically, he's the same secondary parasite that his dad is, just a slightly newer brand of parasitism, copying people that are a little bit more recent. Oh, yes, standing for truth. Several people haven't been aware of that. Yes, Old Scratch says, standing for truth, the SFT is a silly kid apologist. I don't know. I'm not sure that he's a Hovind follower. I haven't seen him channel much of anything of Hovind so far. He may very well be, but all that he has really channeled is John Sanford and genetic entropy arguments. And so he seems more in the Answers in Genesis orbit. He is more prone to copying higher level creationists than Ken Hovind is. I think Hovind would just fall apart if he tried to have a discussion on genetic entropy, whereas you got to hand it to SFT. He's got the pattern down. He talks about homozygosity and all of this stuff. He's got all of the tropes. But when you start probing him, and I have, both me and Jackson Wheat have debated standing for truth, and he just pulls the same rabbits out of the same hat over and over again. He's very monotonous and not as truculent as Nephilim Free or some of these others that get into that. But from a source methods direction, he's still a secondary parasite. And he can't be really pushed to do any source checking. The Old Scratch says first interacted with him in Hovind's comment section. May very well be. There's an awful lot of kind of gather the wagons in a circle defense mode. You'll have people who are not necessarily doctrinal young earth creationists, but they'll come in or be into a feed or have trawled a little bit off them, and they'll defend the basic position, because usually most of them don't get to the point of discussing data field. And they don't necessarily go into the fiddly bits of their theology. They're offering generic anti-evolution attacks in which a lot of intelligent designers can link arms with answers in Genesis if they don't get too close. That's one of the reasons why John Sanford has been able to leak over into intelligent design, because they just talk about these kind of genetic arguments, and it sounds all very intelligent designy, and you don't really spot the parts where Sanford is pointing out that he thinks that Noah was a real person and that lived to be 800 years old, and that the ages of the patriarchs is real in Genesis. He's a young earth creationist, but it doesn't pop up. And even Denise O'Leary has started to channel some of the stuff, and Salvador Cordova, who Jackson Wheat had a chat with just earlier this week, that I went, whoa, okay, that was fun. He's ended up as to be a young earth creationist, and definitely another Sanford groupie. So you get, I like to kind of figure out where people are coming from, which is another reason for asking methods questions. Whenever you interact with an anti-evolutionist, you want to figure out, are they a young earth creationist or not? Who are they drawing on? What sources? You'll often find deer in the headlight moments, though, if you try to find out where they're getting their sources from, because a lot of them either don't know because they forgot, or they don't tell because they maybe think that that's, well, you're just going to go poo-poo on it. Well, yeah, because they're poo-pooable. So if you want to make an argument, find an Andy, but make it. Be honest about it. I'm not at all shy about what I'm going into. Anyway, the stuff that I put in the secondary show link, I thought was an interesting bunch of stuff. There was a Kent Hovind video that was just from last December, and it was basically diatribing on geology stuff. There's this O'Rourke quote from 1976 that turned out, I wasn't able to put a linkage up because it's not openly accessible, but I was able to get access to it by around the corners. It was in this American Journal of Science, and it's basically a weird philosophical essay that's kind of like a Marxist dialectical analysis of the radiometric dating. And it's a strange piece to look at, and irrelevant to the data field because it's like 40 some odd years old, and it's not really all that about technical literature. But it's got some authority quotes in there that get popped up in the creationist literature. And my suspicion is, can't simply glean this from a quote mine. I put up a link to a Henry Morris article that does a lot of the same quotes, and you can use those as a comparison. That was from 1977. Korag was saying that on this matter of God and debates and that, he dodged every question I asked him about the evidence for mammal and Neanderthal extinction being due to genetic entropy, and he avoided those questions. Yep. It's because this is another issue that's really at the core of source methods. It's apply it. If you have an argument, you have to think it through, and you should be able to apply it to new data. And what's so revealing is how many of these people with Cordova, for example, Jackson would be bringing up subjects with him, and Cordova would be, oh, I haven't heard of that. I didn't know about that. I haven't heard. What? Are you getting into a technical field where you're trying to dislodge modern evolutionary genetics and you don't know these terms? If you're not familiar with the playing field, why do you think you know something about the playing field? And all if people simply rely upon Sanford or other authority figures or me or anybody else without doing any of the reading themselves, do not ever confuse a primary and a secondary source. That was one of the big lessons that I got from my historiography teacher, and it is the prime directive of source methods. If you read a quote on any subject, whether it's about what a creationist says or what an evolutionist says, and it's from a secondary source, always remember it's from a secondary source. And until you have read it in the original text, you don't know that quote. You only know what it has been claimed about the quote. It may turn out to be a completely valid quote, or it may turn out to be something that was taken egregiously out of context. And there are occasional times when people will be criticizing creationists for things that are really unfair, and that only plays into their persecution complex if you go after them on a point that they really didn't do. No, there's more than enough twaddle in creationism that you don't have any shortage of ammunition to go at. And that's why I hit things that I know extremely well, like the reptile-mammal transition, because I have at hand all of that stuff. But there's other areas that I'm also dealing with. Brian says Cordova can at least admit he doesn't know. He's kind of bleary-eyed about that too. He's just, yeah, I don't know that. Yeah. And there's no light bulb going off in his head that if he doesn't know that much, why does he think he can apply arguments that he hasn't fact-checked to these other things? Anyway, along the way in that Kent Hovind video that I put up was one that I just couldn't resist. And it had to do with a thing that I suspect Hovind got it from a creationist who got it from an article in National Geographic that it took me a while to track down. And I finally was able to glom onto it. It turned out to be from a 1991 very short little blurb. It had to do with bird evolution. And ironically, Kent Hovind was just a little ways ago. I did a video on it complaining that Archaeopteryx was a fake. Now he turns around and decides, no, it's just a bird. Can we make up our mind, Kent? Along the way, he talks about, well, the tooths that you find in these ancient birds is no transitional thing because there's a hummingbird with teeth today. And I went, whoa, oh. Well, it turns out it's this marvelous thing. I found this one website that I didn't put the link up on it because it's not terribly detailed and there's not any technical literature on the subject, but it happens to be Androdon equatorialis. And they're not teeth. They are serrations in the beak. And they'll be probably working out the reason why they do what they do. Tooth-billed hummingbird derives its name from its straight bill. It has a prominent hook tip and backward-pointing tooth-like serrations on the distal half. This modification is absent on the female bill and thus may be related to sexual selection. More plausible, though not necessarily mutually exclusive, is that this distinctive bill morphology, found in 27 other hummingbird genera, is an adaptation for nectar robbing of flowers with inaccessible nectar, and adaptation convergent with flower piercers. Ta-da! And so the idea that this was giving you something about supposedly diffusing how teeth occur in ancient dinosaurs and finally disappear in birds, and we still have the remnant genes for some of these things knocking around in birds today, is done away with by something that isn't in fact teeth. And the poor Kent Hovind can't figure out how to read or look up the original material to find out. More daisy chaining. Let's see what else we got going on in there. Korag points out the double standard that goes on in creationist apologetics, that Kent Hovind and the like will go on about how fossils prove a worldwide flood and fish being fossilized with gills open and clams on mountains. But fossils can't ever tell you anything about an animal other than the fact that it lived, and what you can't tell whether it had babies and all of that. That's very similar trope. So it's a very double standardy sort of thing. And the point is that no, fossils can tell you a heck of a lot about stuff. And if you read the paleontology, which Kent doesn't, you'll know that. Another point that I brought up in the linkages section had to do with another bit. I try to put in some of the things that are occurring fairly recently in my memory. So as I go, ooh, I've done research on that, I might as well put it into Evolution Hour. This fellow, Jay Andrew, who is a very credulous and annoying origins or buster creationist on Twitter. And he very rarely bumps into much in the way of source citation. Well, this one he decided to rely on. He linked to this secondary source, which said that atheist brains are using less of their brains than believers do. Ta-da! Like, this means what? Well, I already had the technical paper involved on this thing, and it said the exact opposite of what they were implying. That the secondary source that Jay was relying on was missing the point of the paper. It's that the section in the brain that kind of keeps you from making or that tends to make you do snap judgments and kind of go with the emotional thing, that will get shut down typically in non-believers. So the believing brain is making use of a certain kind of modality, and that can be deactivated, and that's more likely to be occurring in atheists. Well, this is an indication of how people believe things that aren't true and what sort of things are going on in terms of the dynamic. But he was trying to give the impression that poor atheists are ones with 5 neurons tied behind our back, and we're behind the curve on things. But you'll find the paper, Humberg, I think the name is of it, I think from 2015, 2016. I put the link up to it. That's an open access paper. And again, on all of this stuff, we'll see how subsequent research goes on and as additional material goes on. But there's an increasingly interesting blob of technical literature that's been investigating what goes on in the brains of people who believe things of varying kinds, and the things that generate how that happens and what dynamics are going on. And this is not going to be terribly helpful for the creationist worldview, because it's starting to explain more and more about what's going on in our little meat computer. It also is no necessarily indication that religion is ever going to go away. I mean, these are common dynamic properties of human brains. And so they're not something that just disappears overnight or may never. And indeed, there's an interesting dynamic as to whether or not some of these downside problem brain systems also have upsides. There's an interesting connection. I didn't put links up to it, but there's a certain amount of stuff to indicate that autism disorder, at least in mild form, seems to run in families that are very brilliant in engineering and mathematics. And that the same mental facilities that permit you to be a really good engineer or mathematician, have the kind of mind that works on that stuff, just move it a little notch farther and it can turn into a kind of tunnel vision focus that can lead to autism. And so these yin yangs that are going on, the role of manic depression in art has been noticed for quite some time. The fact that sociopathology seems to be a good feature for many politicians and rulers. That people who are terribly successful often have an ability to talk themselves into thinking they're better than other people. And they can go with it. They're, from athletes and politicians and scientists and others. So there's this yin yang thing, that something that can be in an extreme form extremely annoying can be actually beneficial in a milder form. And that the inability to do that is not necessarily an advantage. And so these are our brains, and our social mix and our interactions of humans are immensely complicated. And so even though I'm a non-believer myself, I don't have the presumption that you still find in a lot of pro-atheist apologetics, is that, well, as more people become reasonable and scientific, the religion will just wither away. Oh, don't bet on that. I don't think that's very likely at all. And that the same thing that produces our rich cultural variety will also produce things where there's going to be a lot of people that will still have faithy beliefs. Now, the faith they believe in will mutate over time, so that you find people today having a religion that's not quite the same as what it was 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. That human beings, the content of that will vary culturally and evolve over time. So we weaned ourselves off witch killing, but some groups are still okay with that. Matt Powell, who's a Hovindista, would like to stone gay people. As a gay person, I'm taking that kind of personal. So you can see how some people are very conservative and others are more liberal, and different brain systems run in different things. So anyway, there's a little background on that. And it's a fun paper to look into, because it's about the cultural and brain dynamics of the fallout of how these systems work out and how they end up relating to dealing with religion issues and superstition issues and other stuff. Now, looking back into the live chat to see what's going on. Yeah, Brian says, Brian Stevens, funny the things biology can tell us about archaeology. What we're finding in more and more of the literature today is interdisciplinary analysis, where people are drawing on varying disciplines to try to put a more holistic view of things. And we're in a very exciting time if we can live through it without melting the icebergs too much and killing ourselves off with wars or anything else. That we have a great deal of optimism to be about. Old Scratch, people worship anything as a religion in Russia that worships Gadget from the old Tailspin cartoon. Well, and there was even a certain number of people that got kind of the forces with you attitudes, that was taking that seriously. And so that's, you can see how religions form in a variety of ways. We make meaning out of things, and we come up with cockamamie things at the drop of a hat. Look at the ancient astronauts. And that one nice thing is to see how examples of this can occur quickly and how others draw upon longer frames. When you look at things like the 9/11 conspiracy theorists, by definition, that's arisen only since 9/11. Whereas creationism has the advantage that we can see long-term generations of anti-evolutionism to see how individuals go, how many of them decide to change their mind, how much of it's cultural, what cultural things does it connect up to. And that's what I've been trying to do in the TIP project as I keep track of more and more examples and connect up more and more dots. And remember to pick my brain. I mean, if you're on Twitter, be sure to follow me. And if you have a question to me, you can absolutely get to me by direct message. I typically get up in the late afternoon, early morning, because I'm a night owl by nature, and then I'll be working until the wee hours on projects. And if the number of tweets that I have in people that I'm following will be, and mentions will be showing up, there'll be hundreds of them by the time I get back up the next day. And so if it's early in the feed, I may theoretically miss that. But if you DM me, then I'm sure to get a thing on. So if you have any questions about any creation evolution issues, something you've heard about, you want to know kind of what the skivvy is, I'll be happy to give my input on it. And the same thing can be done at the website, thetortugan.com. But Twitter is a handy little medium because it's instantaneous and you get quick feedback and stuff that way. And links can be put in and things that can be very, very direct. And the more people that link up in these many ways, I make a point that every time I encounter a scientist whose work is in my bibliography and they're on Twitter, I go ahead and do that. I follow them. And they're giving heads up on the latest research. BJ says, talk for a few more minutes, please. You want to share an article you might want to read? Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've still got at least 8 minutes to go just before 6 o'clock. And what I hope that this show can do, and other shows like it, is to act as an interactive medium. Remember that there's comment sections on the video once it's posted. Anybody can go into that. I get notifications on that. When creationist C. Brown pokes his head up, which he tends to do, I see little notifications of it on Google Chrome, and I'm able to respond to it. I even see it on my smartphone. So I try to keep up on that. And all of that's public. So that I don't like to delete things like that. I want everybody's record to be there, and you can see it. And future scholars can go through and figure these things out themselves and make meta-analyses of things. And the more people who put their expertise on the line and follow good methods and build up a good reputation, that they can interact, so that if somebody doesn't know something, somebody in the network will know something. And that means that if you're debating people or you're interacting with people where you're going to be defending an argument, you can marshal as close to real time as possible a powerful response. I have, I'm still a rank amateur at it, but there are instances of where I can bring up specific technical literature on very specific points. When they say, well, is there any evidence of that paleogenomic stuff? Oh, yeah. Bloop. And give them a thing that will be open access that anybody can look at. And even if they're lazy and don't want to look at it, anybody following in the feed can see it, and they can follow up on it themselves. So hopefully there will be seeds planted and methods, things that by our fruits shall we know us, that we can follow up on that. Yeah, thank you for that link. There we go. And I will put that in there and get to looking at that. Let me see what that is. I don't have my bibliography up because I closed down my big memory hog things when I'm on the show here. Whoops, I got it. Forgot to mute my screen there. And history of the evolution debate. Yes, I'll take a look at that in due course. Darwin in America, David Maskey, 29. Oh, that's brand new. Yeah. Pew Research Center. Oh, that should be neat. Yeah, thank you very much on that. I'll tell you that it's physically impossible for any person to be able to keep track of everything all on their own direct bit. And I depend wonderfully on all of the connecting threads that I link up to, because I check PNAS, which is Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, if you're not aware of it, pnas.org. If you're not aware of this, well, for God's sakes, why not? That's one of our wonderful places. They're weekly. Science and Nature, I also look at, but they don't have open access in the way PNAS does. Everything in PNAS is open access after a year, and chunks of it are open access from the get-go. And those I'm getting dozens of technical articles every week off of them that are relevant to the points at issue. Lisa for Truth says, I heard scientists pushed back the first sign of life on Earth. What's your take? Well, it's not back a lot. They're still talking pretty much in the 4 billion-year-old range. The earliest fossils they can be really certain about are in the 3.8 billion-ish era. And it depends on, some of these things are becoming so fragmentary at that stage, and some of them are based upon carbon radio isotope balances that are indicative of life. But at the very least, it's bacterial. And another thing, I've mentioned this in some of the stuff that I've done on origins issues. Everybody should remember Luca, last universal common ancestor. That's the as yet hypothetical organism that would be bacteria-ish. That would be the thing from which all life on Earth presently is descended from. But this is not necessarily the first life. It's just the one that won out and which all life on Earth is physically descended from. So Luca has a bunch of inferred qualities as to what kind of cellular systems they've got. It wouldn't be, it would be a prokaryote, not a eukaryote. It would have DNA and RNA and the like, but it would be not the version that's used in eukaryotes. There would be no mitochondria, there would be no chloroplasts, it wouldn't be like plants and that. So there's a lot paring back. There's still a lot going on there. And my suspicion is that Luca is still hundreds of millions of years after the origin of life. But we have no fossil record going on that. And we're hampered from the other direction because the things that would have been going on pre-Luca, we're just seeing the very dim hints and traces of, like little fossil iceberg blips that are embedded in the system that we see. The fact that the ribosome that builds the proteins out of amino acids, the core of that is not a protein at all. It's an RNA molecule. That really blew everybody away when that was discovered maybe about 5-10 years ago. And so ribosomes and ribozymes, these RNAs that have a kind of life of their own, are presumably playing a role. As I pointed out, another area that it's likely that the earliest life didn't, or by the time you get to the things leading into Luca, that the DNA code may not have been triplets, but duplexes, 2 codons generating amino acids in a smaller protein set. And all of that's still ongoing work. But yeah, a good ballpark figure to use is about 4 billion years ago. And that's effectively, the one thing I will say is effectively, it's essentially as soon as the bombardment that was forming the Earth and bringing oceans in and doing all sorts of jiggly things to the Earth, as soon as that lowered to the point where things were a little more settled and you could have stable oceans, boop, life appears. And that's telling us something very interesting about how kind of direct and automatic the processes are, but we don't yet have all the pieces pinned down, so it's not a resolved issue yet, and I don't claim it is. Let's see. Oh, and another link to put into my looking at paper stuff. Okay, which one is that? Another one. Positively twisted. Oh, yeah, that would be one of those that's being set up for future publication. Patrick Fortier is a big league player in that. Complex evolutionary history of reverse gyrates suggests a non-hyperthermophilic last universal common ancestor. Yeah, that's a big debate about temperature. Let me put a screen share on this so you can see what the hell's going on here. Oops. Come on. There we go. And the article it's referring to, because it's a bioarchive, it's not hit an actual journal yet. So although you'll be able to get the full text just by downloading the PDF, and it will probably appear somewhere or other, but it doesn't say where, it's something that I would be getting for future reference. And a Catchpole, his name rings a bell, but definitely Patrick Fortier does. I got a bunch of his stuff in my bibliography. And by non-hypothermophilic, hypothermophilic means likes to live in hot conditions. A non-hypothermophilic one would be one that didn't necessarily have to live in a hot environment, which means issues about hydrothermal vents and the origin of life. So this one could be very, very interesting. And there's still a hot debate about how hot the early life conditions needed to be for the development of life. It looks like an awful lot of it is going on in the oceans, of course, deeper oceans, down by hydrothermal vents, not involving stuff at the surface because you've got no ozone layer, no oxygen up in there to shield stuff. The ultraviolet radiation was more intense at that time. And of course, the sun was somewhat colder, but there were compensatory mechanisms for that. So it's a fascinating jigsaw puzzle. J-Max says, could viruses have originated from a separate source, or do we share the same starting point? Oh, that is a hot topic. Ooh, and I don't know the answer to that, and nobody knows yet. It's literally fist fighting issues as to, are viruses foam on the beer that are generated from biological processes, or are some of them reflective of pre-living systems and the components of those? And it's probably a little bit of both. Remember, viruses can be a lot of different things. Many of them, or most of them, I think, are RNA, which brings up RNA again. But there are some DNA viruses, and there are even some kind of proteoids, whatever they all are, viral structures that are all kind of reflecting how things can go on without the cell-generating replication mechanism. Viruses are like little packets of stuff, and some of them look like little industrial machines. They're really weird. And if they were designed, the designer's creepy. But yeah, it's probable. My reading of the literature would suggest that most of the viruses that we deal with are relatively recent and are not holdovers from the start of life. But aspects of viruses and dim and distant structures in certain viruses may very well reflect things that were going on before the LUCA got started. But that's still fighting words, things going on in the debate. And it's hard to resolve because you can't get in a time machine and look. You know, you can only look at the things you have available, and we're billions of years removed. It's not easy to do that. And Neprakos mentions the flood would have melted the planet a few hundred times over. Yeah, I've called attention to that in the new book about all of the implausibilities of a global flood, that all the attempts to, they're trying to squash too much into too little a time. And you end up with thermodynamic problems that way. Or to accelerate radioactivity requires you have temperatures hotter than the sun. I mean, that's not very comfortable. So it's a weird thing. Yeah, Neprakos says, turns out when you crank up the scale of any catastrophe, it has unintended physical consequences. Who'd have thunk it? So what you have, and that's another reason for reading lots of creationists, you can discover the creationists' flood geology has evolved over time. That the kind of ice canopy, vapor canopy notions that were knocking around in the 60s and 70s have fallen by the wayside because they won't work. And so they aim at a completely different approach. And now most modern creationists have adopted plate tectonics. So they have these funhouse hypercontinental things and then fountains of the deep. They're very fond of those now. So all the water squirting up and continents moving around and giant islands of forests that get baked into coal forests instantly. And then other areas are flash freezing as the ice age. Too much going on all at once. No. And so some creationists will start working the math. You got to hand it to them. They're trying to be sciencey and realizing that, we just hit another snag. Same thing for attempts to try to resolve relativity theory and the distances to the galaxies, to try to figure out how light can get here from things that aren't really old but are, or look like they're old but aren't, because time is speeding up, and they get into messes because you tinker with that c, that speed of light, and everything connected to it starts jiggling, and that particularly E = mc square stuff. So Brian Stevenson, part of the problem is viruses don't leave fossils, and in fact most of even the bacteria don't leave fossils, not easily. They require very specialized circumstances. So there's a huge blob of what's going on. In fact, one of the reasons why it was such a shock, I'm old enough to remember when the Earth was thought to be maybe 3.5 billion years old. And then when radiometric dating started kicking in, and they realized that prior to that Cambrian, 500 million years ago, there was a lot more going on because you didn't have that turnover of life. And so they've had to recognize how much bigger the time frame was than they had anticipated, because a lot was going on. In fact, an awful lot of what we would see as the things leading up to multicellularity involved billions of years of windup. Generally speaking, because bacteria they're reproducing by fission, not by sex. Sex recombines the genome faster. And so it's not surprising to think that bacterial evolution is very conservative and tends not to change into new much dynamics. And indeed, almost all of what we see in complex organisms comes about because of that endosymbiotic fusion, where mitochondria come into play. And then you start playing around with new dynamics that can't run because you don't have the power sources for them that eukaryotes can do with their little powerhouses and mitochondria going on in there. So endosymbiotic structures can lead off to more complicated things in a way the bacteria just stay stuck in the rut. Okay, well, there we go. I was all by myself today, and we got some questions and discussions going on in the show. There's another one down the button. Anybody that pops up too, if they have unusual, stupid creationism things or questions that they want to ask, or topics, I've done that before. If somebody comes up with a topic, I'm perfectly happy to deal with that in the show. I will continue to be doing the analysis of contested bones because it's a fascinating thing, and I'm learning more about it all the time. By the way, they've been averaging now only about 1.8 sources per page. It's been dropping gradually, which is really low for a technical argument. So even though they've got a lot of technical papers in there, there's a lot of repetition too. And as the book gets longer and longer, that overall percentage rate is dropping. It's only about 300 some odd sources so far in the book. I have 2,300 in Evolution Slam Dunk. So that gives you some difference between a citation heavy work and one that's a little bit thinner. But anyway, keep on trucking with the show. Tell everybody about it. People to subscribe. Let them know that the old fart RJ here has some interesting things to say now and then, and has a mission. Source methods, and make Tortugan alert trending. Korag says it's the Psi 10 Brugengate argument. I had a brief interaction with Psi. He's like Nephilim. He's somebody that just has the one note Charlie thing, and you just can't get him off of it. And he's not somebody you can have a conversation with. I mean, Mike Riddle, at least, the young Earth creationist, is a fuddlehead, but he was one that would actually answer a question. And that's, to my mind, more interesting. But there are some creationists that are just bloody annoying. And I'm sure there are some evolutionists in that there are as well, where you ask them a straight question and they just go back onto their hobby horse. Well, hopefully I'm not like that. And I never want to be able to be accused of warranting a Tortugan alert on myself. So there we are, 8 past the hour. I will be seeing all you gang next week, and keep spreading the word. And those who can help out with the projects at the finance end, do so if you can, and be sure to get Slam Dunk. And if you like reading fiction, get Paralogs of Phileas Fogg too. You can find that linked up at Amazon as well. I'm plowing along. Writing 2 books simultaneously is interesting because I'm writing the second Fogg novel, and I'm also doing The Rocks Are Still There, and multiple chapters in each one because I'm revising one section and then reviewing one of the other, and writing a third. And so sometimes my brain can get near steam coming out, frazzle mode. Even I, the RJ, do have my limits. And but we're plowing away the best we can and trying to make progress. And given the fact of where I was a few years ago, I've moved beyond from where I was. I'm doing YouTubes. I've got some Patreons where actually money is trickling in. I've got books out there to look at. I should love to do more debates. Yeah, I don't want to get hijacked when on your own. I'd love to do debates. I love to do lecturing. If you know people, I can do Skypes. I can do YouTubes like this, video lecturing. And if you can pay my way, I'm happy to take a trip. So I'm available for these kinds of things. Brian, yes, great talk. Looking forward to getting your fiction after getting Evolution Slam Dunk. Yeah, I'm very proud of the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. It's a mystery science fiction retelling of Around the World in 80 Days. It reflects secular values. It reflects kind of my worldview, and it's got sharp kick butt characters. And don't forget the electric guns. and The Thing in the Box in Chicago. Whatever is that? So anyway, I'll leave that with a teaser, and I'll put the title of the thing up there, The Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. They're both books are available. You can find the links at my website in both the ebooks and the print versions. There are people who have read the thing. Make sure of reading the reviews. And if you have it already, either one of the things, for heaven's sakes, or not for heaven's sakes, make sure you rate, review it, and tell everybody about it. So there we are. We're 10 past the hour. My goodbyes are saying goodbye, and I will say goodbye about the goodbyes, and then we'll say hello next week. So bye, gang.